Hi, I'm Stephen England from the Art of Sustainability, and we're running an interview today with Herbert Girardet. Herbie, to his friends, is a prolific author. He's an anthropologist, a conference speaker and international consultant in the field of cultural and urban ecology. He's a recipient of a UN Global 500 Award for Outstanding Environmental Achievements, a member of the Club of Rome and the World Academy of Art and Science, and an honorary fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. He's a former chairman of the Schumacher College, UK, and a trustee of a charity, Artist Project Earth, or APE. In 2003, he was inaugural thinker in residence in Adelaide, Australia, developed regenerative strategies for South Australia, which have largely been implemented. He's a co-founder, former director, and honorary member of the World Future Council. He's worked and consulted extensively in the UK, Middle East, and more recently, China. That's a lot. You've been a very busy man, Herbie. Very busy indeed. But we're going to be focusing today on the Club of Rome, which Herbie's a member of. Yeah. And in particular, the recent report, 2018, that came out from the Club of Rome, called Come On. We're going to be looking at a particular aspect of this report, which is referred to as the New Enlightenment, or Enlightenment 2 within the report. And I know for lots of people that's a difficult concept. Just the word enlightenment is heavy with darkness for a lot of people. There's so much in here that we could talk about so much for such a long time. But we're going to be focusing on what that means in terms of what the Enlightenment was in the past and what the Enlightenment is, this new Enlightenment going future. And the theme of this talk is the shadow of the Enlightenment. Mm-hmm. And the reason for that is because we're looking at the idea of that everything we do as humans has casts a shadow. And the question is, how can we carry on given all the challenges we face and are given in the report, and cast a more benign shadow, a less darker shadow than we've cast. For now, we'll just start with the old Enlightenment, the Enlightenment that was, and just touch upon that in terms of what the Enlightenment was and what the new Enlightenment is going to be. So if we could just touch upon that. Sure.
Well, the Enlightenment really grew out of the beginnings of the scientific revolution in the 17th century, particularly with somebody like Descartes. And his famous statement was, "I think, therefore I am." And that in some ways superseded a previous set of thought, which was before that, when people were primarily religious. It was really, "I believe, therefore I am." I think, therefore I am really means suddenly the human mind and rationality comes to the fore, challenging in many ways the kind of religious state of mind that existed before that. And that in some ways set humans free to begin to explore what nature is all about, what the universe is all about in ways as never before. Once you set God aside, as to some extent happened in the Enlightenment, you begin to put human beings into the center stage. And that's really what has happened in that time. So suddenly there was a whole range of new scientific developments in astronomy, in biology, in physics, in chemistry, in medicine, and so on, in food sciences. And suddenly human beings began to explore how their own power to influence the world became much more important. So certainly the Industrial Revolution was a direct result ultimately out of the Enlightenment, and that in turn has led to many of the issues that we are facing today. Of course, the center stage aspect of the Industrial Revolution was the introduction of steam technology. Suddenly we had the capacity for the first time to dig deep into the earth crust, get out fossil fuel resources as never before, not only just to make fires, but to turn fire into steam, into power. So human beings have been powered by fossil fuel technology ever since, and in many ways that is the starting point of the great problems that we are facing today, with climate change, with all manner of pollution that we are today facing, and all the aspects of how we are affecting the planet as never before.
And I want to drill into that a little bit more and start with the idea of Descartes, and the idea of separation, that Descartes introduces and the mechanistic worldview that still predominates in our time today, and how that separates us from nature, and then we see nature as brute force and for our own purposes, and how this informs our thinking and informs the shadow that we're casting in terms of that sense of disconnect which sits within the Enlightenment. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. But basically, once you introduce the idea that we live in a mechanistic universe rather than an organic universe, which in some ways was what was the main predominant thinking before that, you are suddenly in a situation where you change the nature of thinking fundamentally. And that also became the basis of humanism, which is directly related to the rationalism that emerged out of the Enlightenment. So suddenly human beings, center stage, we are no longer biological beings in a sense as a result of our uses of technology that arise from that. We become what I call the amplified man. Today we are powered by technology as never before, particularly through steam and energy technologies. And so certainly that has set us aside and separated us from nature as never before. If I stand next to a hunter-gatherer who's been harvesting from nature without really modifying it, I'm a completely different creature. Biologically, ultimately we're the same, but I am today amplified by technology as a direct result of the inventions that came out of the Enlightenment. And so certainly today, for instance, my use of fossil fuels is incredible. I mean, I'm part of a civilization where every year we're burning the equivalent of 1 million years worth of fossil fuels every year to make our industrial urban civilization possible. So that is a direct result of many of the mindsets that emerged out of the Enlightenment in the first instance.
And I know you, as part of your film work, you worked with indigenous peoples in the Amazon, and you are quite passionate about the way that they behave towards the world around them, which is very different from the amplified man, from the way we live our lives. And I know that from conversations we've had over a period of time about your views on religion and your views on indigenous belief systems. Could you touch upon that?
Well, if you live as a hunter-gatherer or an indigenous person somewhere in a rainforest, or as in Greenland, or in every kind of environment on the planet, there were hunter-gatherer people, and their lifestyle depended on an understanding of nature. Without being able to integrate into the natural system that you don't modify very much as a hunter-gatherer, basically you need to understand how it works. So you need to understand what you need to harvest in order to supply the food to your family. You need to be able to know how much you can take from nature without destroying it. And all of that is based on, in many ways you could call a kind of scientific understanding of a sort of pre-scientific, in modern terms, understanding of nature. So for instance, in the Amazon, tribal people have hundreds of words for green, because green is the color that surrounds them. The Eskimos, Inuit people in Greenland have hundreds of words for snow, because there's so many different types of snow and ice that surrounds them. I have a friend who studied with the Kayapo people in the Brazilian Amazon, and they found that they had a word for every insect, for every plant, for every living being surrounding them. So that sort of understanding is accumulated over millennia, over thousands of years, in ways, of course, that we do not have today. More recently, when the world moved towards having just one God, the God of Christianity, of Judaism, basically here, that then becomes the predominant concept. So you're no longer primarily focused on the local environment that you've got to know over eons of time, but on the kind of idea of the one God that dominates everything. So those kind of belief systems already allow or make us depart from our integration in nature that precedes a modern civilization. And that is, of course, in many ways then replaced by modern science, where once again we are trying to understand nature in new ways, but at the same time we are doing it in a very compartmentalized way. Today, if you speak to a physicist, you cannot easily talk to a chemist or a doctor. Basically, modern science compartmentalizes in ways that directly contributes to our separation of nature, because we've lost that integrated view of nature that predominates the lifestyles of tribal people.
So in looking forward to the new Enlightenment,
Yeah.
what are the distinct differences between the Enlightenment that we inherited and we still live in, and the new Enlightenment? What would you say the key changes in terms of?
Yeah.
We'll talk about some of the technology going forward,
Sure.
but in terms of the underlying thinking,
Yeah.
what is different? What needs to change, do you think, taking into account the things you've been touching upon?
Well, the critical issue now is to get a new holistic understanding of the living world that we live in. The reality is that we've been on a collision course with nature ever since the Industrial Revolution, and that has culminated in the incredible impacts of the humanity today in the age is called the Anthropocene, the age of man, where basically humans have taken the role of geology in terms of the sheer scale of our impacts on the environment. So that is a reality today. We are confronted with unprecedented numbers of human beings, from 1 billion or so in 1800 to nearly 7 billion today. But beyond that, it's also the incredible impact of economic growth that has emerged as a result of our uses of technology. So suddenly we are in a situation where we are faced with disaster in terms of the emergency that we are now in, but at the same time we do not have the kind of full understanding that we need to really develop in order to cope with the fact that we cannot outgrow living nature. We are currently in the process of destroying wherever we look, through pollution, through burning fossil fuels, through our uses of technology, through plastics in the ocean. All these issues that are now in the news all the time are the direct result of a lack of an integrated understanding of how humanity needs to integrate into the living environment on this planet. So the key term, in my view, is a new type of understanding. The concept of Gaia, the living planet, of course, feeds into that very nicely. It came out of the 1970s. James Lovelock and others since developed it. And basically, we are beginning in scientific terms now to see a new integration of biology with physics, with chemistry, and an overview and a holistic overview of how nature works and how we as human beings need to integrate within the process of the circular systems of nature. The fundamental difference between modern economies and nature's economies. The modern economy is essentially linear. It takes resources from nature. We use it in our daily lives in terms of products that we buy in the shop. Then we dump the stuff, and it ends up as pollution somewhere else in nature. Nature works as essentially circular system. All waste in nature get reabsorbed into the soil and become the basis for future growth. And that is when you look at walk around in a forest, as we're able to do in this wonderful environment here in the Wye Valley, you can learn from the way nature works as a circular system. And that is so terribly important to understand. So we need to have this new understanding of the integration of all the different bodies of knowledge that we have today into one body of holistic ecology that understands how we in the future need to relate to nature in a fundamentally different way.
Within the context of the report and this conversation, it's very much about reconnecting.
Yeah.
And finding that reconnection,
Yeah.
and looking at complex systems rather than isolated systems.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
that's the key issue, certainly. I mean, one shouldn't say the Enlightenment was wholly bad, I mean, it's very important to understand that we have developed our human minds in remarkable ways as never before. I mean, obviously the knowledge of tribal people in a place like the Amazon in the past was very localized in terms of how they lived, and if they moved to a different place, they would have been at a loss. I mean, that happened to North American Indians when they were shifted from one part of North America to another part. Suddenly, they were not familiar with the environments around them. We are today trying to, through our minds, through our through our rationality, trying to develop a global picture of how we in our daily lives here in our local environment here need to nevertheless have a global understanding of how the world works and how we as our individual in our individual way of life need to relate to that. So it's a great challenge, and of course it's an educational challenge, and it's quite hard for people who are not in a daily way living off nature, for instance doing gardening or involved in food growing in some way, but living as urban people to get hold of this kind of new knowledge of holistic integration with nature. We need to move from the mechanical concept that Descartes came up with to a new kind of organic concept. There's a fundamental difference between mechanism and organism, and that we need to understand that very clearly.
So, following on from what we were talking about in terms of the Enlightenment, in terms of the Enlightenment that was and the new Enlightenment and the need for reconnection, and a different type of thinking, the cyclical thinking, holistic type of thinking. I think I want to move on to focus in a little bit onto the idea of technology.
Good, yeah, sure.
In terms of the idea of nature as energy, which we harness and make use of. I think the key question for me here at the moment, and somebody working in the area of sustainability, I hear a lot about, it seems to just be about if we can just move from a carbon-based economy to a renewable-based economy, then that we can carry on as we are, without any kind of fundamental, profound change in terms of our relationship with the natural world, which is what we were discussing. So if we can sort of break that down into the two sections. First of all, just to pose the question to you: is it about simply moving from a carbon-based economy to a renewables-based economy?
Well, first of all,
what does that mean and entail?
Yeah. Well, first of all, when you mention the term carbon-based economies, I mean that on the one hand relates to our energy use, but on the other hand, we are carbon ourselves. All the food that we produce is carbon too. So I mean, we're never going to get away from being, to quite an extent, carbon-based in the way we live. But the critical issue in this context, of course, is that we have been so reliant on fossil fuel energy, in ever since the Industrial Revolution, in this extraordinary way. It started, of course, in the UK, and it went to Europe, Germany, then America, and so on. So everywhere people found coal and oil and gas, of course, they started digging deep into the ground, and the technologies became ever more sophisticated. Deep sea oil now comes from 5 kilometers down underneath the ocean floor, and so it's unbelievable what has happened with carbon-based energy technologies, all to kind of power our motor cars, our airplanes, our hot water systems in our houses, and so on and so forth. So we are taking it for granted, and just a switch of a flick of a switch, of course, gives us access to this energy. So it's become incredibly convenient to live this way, and we started it in Europe. Now the rest of the world wants to copy us, and of course has done so to a great extent. So all of this became a concern in the 1970s, and so the beginnings of the renewable energy revolution really started about that time. So suddenly people said, okay, is it possible to power the world with renewable solar, and particularly solar and wind energy instead? And so these were questions that were starting to be asked at that time, but now we are beginning to have answers to these questions. So the reality is that the technology has been transformed beyond recognition. For instance, wind power technology in the 1970s was 50 kilowatt turbines. Now we have up to 12 megawatt turbines already in action in places like the North Sea. Similarly, solar energy was tiny little panels initially developed for space flight. Now suddenly you can find them on houses all over the world. So that's all because of technological breakthroughs, but also because of the breakthrough in terms of costs. As the production goes up massively, the costs go down. So that happened with all renewable energy technologies. So suddenly we are now talking about cost parity between fossil fuel energy and renewable energy. So that's a fantastic breakthrough, and very important and very exciting. So without that, we couldn't even begin to talk about a sustainable future. So now we have this. The question is, okay, how fast can we go for 100% renewable? And certainly that's beginning to happen in quite a few places. I worked in Adelaide, South Australia, introduced feed-in tariffs there. They're now at 50% plus renewable electricity from solar and wind. In Denmark, similar figures. In Germany, also coming up to that kind of figure. But that's still mainly electricity rather than also transportation and other uses of energy. So we are rapidly moving towards electric vehicles, towards houses not powered any longer by oil and gas and coal, but by electricity instead. All very, very good news, though the downside is, of course, the materials used in these technologies also have an environmental impact to some extent. Then it's a question not only the use of energy technology in terms of input, but also efficiency. So obviously we have to make new kind of houses, we have to retrofit existing buildings, making them much more energy efficient. All that these are steps in the right direction. But then if you argue, okay, that's enough, then of course you are in trouble, because it is only part of the aspect of our impacts on nature today. We would still be having to build more tarmac roads if we continue to have more electric vehicles. We would still use metals in all kinds of ways for the rest of the economy. So we need to go much more deeply into understanding nature and saying, okay, if we are serious about a circular, regenerative type of economy, obviously regenerative renewable energy is a key part of that, but it's certainly only a component of that. So the thinking about how to live in ways that nature can cope with in terms of human activity, it is all about rethinking our economic systems as well, and our general attitudes to consumerism. We as consumers today are very one-dimensional, concerned only with buying and consuming stuff that we can buy and that we are told to buy from advertising. But instead, the point has come to understand much more deeply how our overall life affects the environment. And it's not just climate change and the emissions of fossil fuels that are such a disastrous development now. It's also finding ways of reabsorbing the emissions that we produce whilst we continue to burn energy from fossil fuels. So when you see the burning rainforests in the Amazon or the burning forests in Siberia, you're seeing a reduction in the capacity of nature to absorb carbon emissions. So these are disastrous developments. So in conjunction with moving towards renewable energy, we simultaneously need to move towards protecting and reforesting nature in new ways, in absorbing carbon in the soils, organic farming, regenerative farming. All of these are aspects of the comprehensive change in the way of life that is not essential. Because on our current trajectory, we are destroying the future of our children and their children.
The upshot of all of this is it's not about a technological fix.
No.
It's not a simply case of we're going to move away from, as you say, we are always having an impact, because just by dint of being alive, we are impacting. But in terms of our technology, it isn't just about simply moving to renewables. It's about rethinking the whole way that our economy, not just here in the UK, but across the world, in terms of the whole global economy behaves. But I'd like to just move on a little bit more to the holistic rethink.
Yeah.
And you've touched upon that in terms of your conversation, in terms of how economies work. But at the end of the day, the economies are people.
Sure.
And it's, if it's going to change, it's going to start with the person, with the self, that will inform this new way of thinking within the economy.
Well, it's not an easy one, because we are constantly bombarded with messages to buy. Advertising is all about this, of course, and that's the key part of how economic growth is driven, by encouraging and even forcing people to buy, to become consumers, to not just be a human being in the broadest sense, but basically to be one-dimensional man as consumer, not as parent, not as voter, but basically just being a consumer. So we are being driven in that direction constantly, and as a result, we are also therefore increasing our impact on the environment all the time. So obviously, to rethink that is a fundamental and profound issue, and of course the environmental movement has been all about this. The Green Movement has basically, as a new political movement, argued that we need to change the way we are in terms of the overall being of us as on a day-to-day basis, but I mean also in the deeper sense of what makes us tick, if you like, every day. So certainly the consciousness of consuming in a sustainable way is of absolutely critical importance. So we're seeing a growth in organic farming and organic consuming. People are moving towards vegetarianism. Veganism is on the rise. It's a remarkable development. Young people are saying, I don't want to own a car any longer. So that's an interesting development. People are saying, I don't want to get into airplanes any longer. So all of that is beginning to happen. So people are saying, do I really need 2 televisions or 3 televisions? People are beginning to become aware that whatever we do today leaves an impact on the people that come after us. The concern about, people have always said, I want my children to have a better life than I've had. Well, today if we are not careful, we're moving in the opposite direction because of all these environmental legacies that we're leaving to future generations. As climate change, becomes ever more acute, obviously that has huge impact on individual lives in terms of, 40% of the world's people live somewhere close to the sea. Sea level rises becoming an issue, record temperatures becoming an issue, extreme weather conditions. All of these issues are beginning to become part of the thinking on an everyday basis. So a lot of people, until recently, have sort of poo-pooed the environmental movement, saying, okay, they just want us to consume less, they want us to have less fun. People are suddenly beginning to say, hang on, we need to think much more deeply. And so that is certainly an encouraging development. The only question is, are we rather late in moving in this direction? I mean, the environmental movement has been going on for 40 years or so, and there have been warning signs, in terms of where we should be going for a long time. The Club of Rome 50 years ago published a report called Limits to Growth, saying we cannot have unlimited economic population, urban growth on a finite planet. Well, that was a widely publicized report, 30 million copies published worldwide, but everywhere you looked, economists were saying, no, that's not for us. And then individual people said, okay, we want to carry on with the way we are today. We don't want to continue, want to reduce our standard of living. So people are beginning to talk about quality of life increasingly, rather than just standard of living. So closeness of communities, closeness of families, instead of consuming products, having love, that's a big difference. A friend of mine once said, a lot of people, when they want to feel love, they buy a hamburger, they eat a hamburger instead of getting a hug. So these kind of issues of how we can be happy, the question of happiness is becoming a big issue in the discussion on economics. So all of that is beginning to inform not just us as individuals in terms of our thinking, but also beginning to influence economics thinking. And so there is a global rethink certainly underway. The question is how quickly it's going to happen and how fast it's going to go in terms of becoming mainstream. And that is certainly an unanswered question at this moment in time.
Okay, so I think we will move on from whether it's a technological fix onto who controls technology, who's got the levers of technology, and I think for me it's this one of the questions is it the consumer or is it the person who is producing the product and the services at the end of the day who has control? So if we could just open that up a little bit.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think all technologies are the result of a significant investment of some sort or another. Inventiveness, of course, but then investment. For instance, the steam engine was developed by Stephenson, but then had to be invested in by people who had the money to do so. So once that was the case and the money, the technology was there, then of course it could be exploited for profit. So wherever you look, there's always the combination of inventiveness, technological breakthroughs, and then investment with the eye on making profits from that investment. So people don't tend to invest in a new technology unless they reckon there's going to be a significant return on that investment in due course. So we can see that in all technologies that have developed over time. But when it comes to renewable energy technology in particular, it's a very interesting story because, as we already said, the ideas of developing wind and solar came out of the 1970s. In fact, with solar, it was part of the space program. And that, of course, was a breakthrough that wasn't necessarily linked to getting return from that, but then from that technology. But then once it was transferred to domestic use, i.e. for solar roofs and houses, initially it was completely unaffordable. So then feed-in tariffs for renewable energy were introduced around the turn of the century in Denmark and in Germany. And that was basically a policy by governments to say, okay, allow people to be able to invest in this particular technology in a cost-effective way. If they put a solar roof on their house, they get a bit of a return on that investment. So initially, for instance, where the feed-in tariffs for solar were about 40 times the conventional power station prices that people would pay for the electricity. That then led to a massive ramping up of the uptake of that technology in Germany, in Denmark, before that also in California. And that then led to a dramatic reduction in the price that people have to pay to buy a solar panel or a wind turbine. So cut a long story short, government policy can dramatically drive the move towards uptake of renewable energy. And that has certainly happened historically in a remarkable way. Today, wind and solar is effectively on par in terms of the cost you pay for the electricity produced from this technology as compared with coal or gas-fired power station electricity. So we need government policies in order to stimulate new technologies, and benign, if you like, regenerative, sustainable technologies of the future. That also applies, of course, to, for instance, food systems. At the present time, it is cheaper for people to produce food with artificial fertilizers and so on, completely ignoring the need to recycle nutrients from cities, for instance, to return those to farmland because it's simply cheaper to do so. So we need incentives from government to persuade companies to move in that direction, to move towards investing in renewable and sustainable and regenerative farming systems. And similarly, all the other spectrum of technologies that we use on a day-to-day basis. So unless we have a situation where a technology is already cost-effective, for instance, now with solar and wind, having gone through the process of having been stimulated by feed-in tariffs, now suddenly we hear the governor of the Bank of England saying, investing in renewables is becoming cost-effective. In fact, you're going to make a lot of money from this. So the initial stimulus of policy was necessary in order to reach this point. So everywhere you look, we need government policy in order to drive a move towards a green economy.
So moving on from where you were saying, you were effectively saying about government stimulus. So
Yeah.
the role of government stimulus
Yeah.
in bringing about the changes we need.
Yeah. Yeah, and that of course depends on the ideology of government. So certainly it depends, these policies depend on what type of ideology your government is. My work with the World Future Council, we came up with a whole series of proposals for policies to change the world. And we basically looked at where a particular policy was introduced in a country and how that can be spread to other countries. But then you're up against the problem of ideology. So wherever you have a green government or a green tinge government in place, by definition, you're likely to get progressive technologies that in turn have a beneficial effect on the environment. But in many countries that is not the case. So it's really critically important also to have voting systems, for instance, that it speed up the introduction of green policies through green governments, through the growth of green parties in particular countries.
And so interesting thing for me there, picking up on the theme of the shadow and enlightenment, essentially the shadow of the move towards renewables leaves a lot of people out
Yeah.
of that, and part of what you're seeing reactions to is that people like the Rust Belts, where the technologies
Yeah.
are being, those people have been, those skill sets are no longer applicable
Yeah.
to renewables. So policy isn't just about investing in new technologies and large investors going to that. There's a social dimension to this in terms
Absolutely.
of those people who
Were left behind.
were left behind.
Yeah.
And so this creates this shadow, and the result is people respond to somebody who will say, look, you know, I will speak for you, yeah. So how can policy not just invest in new emerging technologies, but also bridge old technologies and old skill sets that need to come across?
Well, I mean, that relates directly to this sort of history of the Industrial Revolution. When you look at Britain, for instance, there are quite a number of cities whose economy was based on coal and steel. I mean, particularly in North, but also in Wales, you know, take Port Talbot or Swansea, you know, the economies of those cities are based on highly polluting technologies. Then suddenly coal gets phased out and people are left behind and there's no jobs and all the rest of it. So that same story is, of course, you can find in many other countries, particularly also in the United States. I mean, Chattanooga or other cities that were coal and steel based suddenly became redundant as places. So the job of governments, of course, first of all, is to try and find new economies for those regions, for those cities. But certainly sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. For instance, in Britain, we've had zero investment in renewable energy technology. If that had been the case, steelworks in, say, somewhere like Scunthorpe by now should be making towers for wind turbines. But where do those towers come from? They come from Germany, they come from Holland, they come from other countries, from Denmark. They're not produced in this country. So we need to replace, you know, the economies of cities that have lost their raison d'etre by deliberate policies of governments. But it's not always the case that you can replace the technologies that have gone with something that can fully take its place, particularly also because of automation and other developments of that kind. But for instance, take here South Wales. In Merthyr Tydfil and Ebervale, there used to be some of the largest steelworks in Europe. They're gone, but it's an area that has enormous wind power potential, which is not being realized. You could create a whole new energy economy in these very windy valleys in South Wales and replace the economy that is gone with something quite new and quite different based on renewable energy. So that is enlightened government, or in this case it should be the government of South Wales, of Wales, the Parliament of Wales should be taking those types of decisions. But it's not always done, and I mean, it is often governments and politicians are often very short-sighted, and they have, you know, they want to be re-elected in the next election 4 years or 5 years from now. And so they're primarily concerned with short-term issues. So the issue about long-term thinking to be expected from politicians who are caught up in short-term re-election processes is a very problematic one.
And here in Wales, we have the Wellbeing Future Generations legislation, and that creates, opens opportunities for new thinking, investment. So I think the question is, can we carry on with mass consumption if our economy is efficiently recycling? Is that something? Can we carry on with our lifestyles as they are?
Not really,
and
no.
just be more efficient in our use of resources, or does that all have to go as well?
No, I think the whole concept of standard of living needs to be rethought. Obviously, which is a very tricky issue because a lot of people who feel today we have a standard of living that is so much better than in the past, therefore we want more of this rather than less of this. But at the same time, some economists are saying, how about a happiness economy? How about coming to a way of life where we have much greater community existence, you know, where people and neighbors and families are going to fulfilling not just needs of consumption, but also emotional needs. So moving in that direction is now of critical importance. But we certainly haven't seen any concrete development in that direction. We are still seeing everybody, whether it's companies or governments, talking about we need more economic growth because we have to replace lost jobs that come that are lost out of automation, and companies that borrow money in order to invest need to get that money back. For that reason, they need economic growth. So we need to break through fundamentally through that, if you like, vicious cycle of depending on economic growth as a key aspect of our current way of life. And unless we find a really dramatic new way in which to think about economics, that's not going to happen.
So going back to the question of the idea of who controls the development technology, is it the investor or is it the consumer?
Well, today it's primarily the investor wanting to have a return on their investment. But the good news is that certainly some of the forward-looking renewable and regenerative technologies are beginning to become not just cost-effective, but promising significant returns on investment. And this is certainly where when you listen to the Governor of the Bank of England in recent speeches, he said, here is a whole new sector of the economy that should go mainstream. And that, then matches both the need for a good return on investment while simultaneously matching the need for a different way of relating to nature in our daily ways of life.
So is it that we, the consumers, will change our behaviour because the investors are changing their behaviour? Or is it...
Up to a point, yes. I mean, certainly the question still is whether or not, just because we have a dramatic increase in the input of in the availability of renewable energy, that whether that contributes to an overall change in our lifestyles, and that's certainly not certain by any means at this stage.
So Herbie, we've come sort of to towards the end of the conversation. It's been really fascinating. I'm looking at the philosophy that we're going to need for this new Enlightenment, looking specifically following the story of technology. But I think I really want to move on to future generations.
Sure.
And specifically in Wales, as we're saying here we are in Wales with the legislation, the well-being future generations legislation, which is very, very poignant, I think. So I think what, keeping in mind the shadow that has been cast from ourselves and from our predecessors, the shadow that young people are having to live through. I think there's two kind of questions that come out of that. One is, what is the role of the elders ourselves in terms of trying to lessen the shadow, and what message have we got for the younger generation?
Sure.
So if we can just
go into that issue. Okay, fine. Well, I think in Wales we are in a very interesting situation, in fact a unique situation, because there's no other part of the world, country or region which has a future well-being of future generations act. At the World Future Council, which I worked with for 15 years, we tried to bring about a situation where, for instance, the United Nations might have a future generations commissioner. That didn't succeed. We tried it in various other countries at the national level. That didn't succeed, except Wales uniquely decided 5 or 6 years ago to introduce this policy. So suddenly now, uniquely in the world, here is a country that has said, okay, all decisions that we make, whether it's governments or whether it's companies, should be measured or should be weighed up against the impact it has on people 50, 100, 200 years from now. Now that's a really incredible decision to make. And the question, of course, what does that mean in practical terms? So there is this commissioner whose task is to then scrutinize decisions in this way. And certainly she is beginning to kind of make an impact. I mean, take, for instance, road development. I mean, there was recently a plan to build congestion, to relieve congestion on the M4 by building a road right through the Gwent Levels, which is in a pasture and wildlife area. And basically, as a result of her proposals, it was decided not to build that relief road. So that is an important decision, but at the same time some people are very cross about it because it will affect some businesses in Cardiff and elsewhere who would have preferred having more fluent traffic going to those places. By and large, the question of how we can decide today about what we do in order to reduce the pressures on future generations is still a largely unanswered question. Because, for instance, in Wales, there was proposals on the table to build the Swansea Lagoon as a power station. That was not followed through because even though that was a kind of energy policy that would have been very positive in terms of providing electricity on a sustainable and renewable basis. So we are now seeing a kind of conflict between the desire of the Welsh government to have a thriving economy and the decision to really weigh up everything in terms of its benefit to future generations. That also raises the future of farming. In Wales, a very substantial part of the economy is farming. But at the same time, at the moment, policies are not necessarily encouraging sustainable farming. There's a tremendous problem with fertilizer runoff and pesticide runoff from fields into rivers, into streams, into rivers. The River Wye is affected by it, or our local rivers. Similarly, we have cities and towns disposing of their waste into rivers rather than returning it to farmland. So all of these are important decisions that ultimately have to be made, but are still not being made. So there's a very positive intention to have a country that really is concerned about the well-being of people many years from now, but in reality, to implement it is still a very tall order. Nevertheless, I think the world is being forced to think in that direction. And that again is largely due to the pressure of young people. Basically, young people saying, enough is enough. We want a future. And we want not just any old future, we want a good future. We want a future without pollution, without climate change, and all the rest of it. So today we are in a situation we have all the technologies available to us to lead a sustainable, regenerative lifestyle on this planet. The question is whether or not the pressure of young people and organizations can really become so central in decision making that ultimately these are not just dreams for a different kind of future than the one that we are heading towards at the moment if we are not very, very careful. We know that climate change is a huge issue now. We know that pollution of all kinds is causing massive impacts on the world's ecosystem. So all of these things are happening right now and ultimately burdening future generations rather than making life better for the future. So we have a lot of ideas and policies and technologies potentially in place. The question now is implementation. It's great to be optimistic, but optimism has to be realistic at the same time. So I would say we need realistic optimism, but a lot of effort by us all, campaigning effort and determination to really make a difference. And that means filmmaking, that means talks, that means mass movements in the streets, that means occupying cities, that means all these things that catch the media attention. It is very interesting in the last few months, this is August 2019, we have seen a lot of programs on television dealing with climate change, burning forests, pollution of the oceans. All of that is beginning to happen. Now the question is, can we strongly encourage the decision makers, both politicians but also business leaders, to say, okay, yes, there's no other way but to head in that direction.
It's quite interesting because going back to the earlier point about how government creates the conditions for investors to invest in and affect consumers by what they're offering. So within, I know one of the things that you are very keen on is citizen participation, and especially about young people's participation in government. I mean, we have a because of what's going on. I think there's a lot more enthusiasm to get involved, but but the ability for younger people, other than through protest,
Yeah.
to actually get involved in government is a bit of a challenge. So could you just touch upon that?
I certainly can. I have a really nice case study. I think that was worth mentioning here. 17 years ago, in 2003, I was invited to be a thinker in residence in Adelaide, South Australia, by the government of South Australia. My job was to basically look at this region of 1.7 million people and say, okay, it's highly unsustainable. A lot of water is wasted. A lot of energy comes from, all the energy comes from fossil fuels. It's no longer the way to move forward. Can we do things differently? So we had a 10-week process where we involved everybody, all the social groups within South Australia, in meetings every day. We had 3 seminars a day involving students, civil servants, business leaders, environmentalists, the lot. Every day discussing issues like how could we supply energy in the future? What about the future of transport? What about the organic waste of Adelaide? Can that be returned to the local farmland? What about efficient use of water? What about retrofitting existing buildings? It was a brilliant, exciting process. It nearly killed me, but the end result was 32 policies for a sustainable Adelaide, and the good news is they were all implemented. South Australia today has over 50% renewable energy. It returns 100% of its organic waste to its local farmland. It uses recycled wastewater to irrigate that farmland. It has retrofitted a lot of buildings that were highly energy inefficient before. They planted 3 million trees for carbon absorption and for stabilizing erosion. So it's really a very exciting outcome that came from this. These things can be done, but the question is whether we can do it not just on a local scale somewhere in different parts of the world, but globally. And that is the issue now that we really need to put at the top agenda of the United Nations, and beyond that, the G7, the G20, and all the other international bodies, business organizations, the Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's really of critical importance now to get mainstream with all of this. And so the pressure from young people to help implement that is of critical importance.
They are demanding significant changes, and one of the big areas for the younger generations and women's areas is around education.
Yeah.
And the importance of education. They are asking questions of the educational services in terms of how are you, if I'm coming to you and spending my money with you and training with you, what are you doing about my future?
Yeah.
And education, I think, for future generations and people coming through, and the area that I'm very much involved in with the art of sustainability is around a language, because my generation, our generation, come out of a post-war worldview where effectively we are about human development, rebuilding a war-torn world. That narrative has run its course, and future generations, young people, are saying, what is the new narrative? What is the narrative of hope for ourselves? And that's a very important message that they want to hear. They want to hear answers to these questions. And how are we elders? What are we about to hand over to them?
Sure.
A world which gives them meets their needs as much as it's met our needs.
Sure.
So I think, and I know through the Schumacher and through various other organisations, your education is a very important part of what you think is part of not just the technology refix.
Sure.
Going back to the beginning, what we're saying, it's not just about a technological change, it's about a change in education and how we interact and behave and see ourselves as part of the world. So if we could just say something about education.
Sure. Well, of course, environmental sciences are barely taught in schools or even in universities. It's still not a sort of major part of the curriculum. Very few schools have gardens, for instance, vegetable gardens, where kids can learn to grow stuff. So certainly a reorientation in education, both at at secondary, primary school level, at comprehensive level, but also at universities, is of critical importance. But kids will tend to become involved in education and university courses if they reckon there's a job there at the end. So that's certainly an issue. But meanwhile, we need to certainly say, how can we speed up education? Because we all know we have very little time to make the really significant changes that are needed. So I'd say a key part of all this, of course, is social media. So we are seeing all these amazing websites, as well as the TV programs, but websites, so many different websites are now pointing in the right direction in terms of a regenerative future. That's certainly beginning to happen. But the question is really how to speed up perceptions of change, not just in the minds of people growing up today, young people today, but also existing decision makers, because they have to reorientate as well. In fact, without them changing their ways and changing the focus of what they do, we are buggered basically anyway. So speed of education is critically important today, and so we have the media to do that. But certainly overall, the question of how we match the need for change with the need for moving in the right direction in terms of how we think is still a somewhat unanswered question. When we talk about economics once more, the reality of creating circular economies, which is absolutely central to all of these discussions, we are still not seeing significant change in that direction. So unless we are really going to get people to focus up to the seriousness of what we are facing very quickly, then we are really not going to match the need for change in the way that we urgently need to.
It's this idea that we have everything we need, we just need to get on with it at the end of the day, and accelerate and focus our attentions on the biggest challenge we face, planetary challenge we face, which is climate change, and we haven't really gone into that area because it's such a huge area in its own right, and we've stayed with the technology. So what's your message of hope? What if you could sum it up? I mean, we've touched upon these huge challenges. What would you say? Just two or three words. A message of hope.
Well, the loudest message of hope really comes from young people today, not only from going to the streets and demonstrate, but also from other young people. I mean, hardly publicized, for instance, is an initiative of a German kid who started as a 10-year-old saying, okay, we need to plant trees, 1 billion trees on this planet. So they started a 1 billion trees program, and they very cleverly linked up with all sorts of local groups around the planet. And they're now saying no longer billion trees program, but trillion trees program. So that is of really critical importance for that kind of message to be driven home. We've seen massive deforestation globally as a result of the development of modern civilization. We need to put trees back in place, and so there's about 3.5 billion trees on this planet. So we have taken about half away from logging over the centuries. There used to be about double that number before. Now there's this movement to say, okay, let's plant not just 1 billion but a trillion trees. So that's very encouraging. Then farming systems that are being developed, organic farming, permaculture, agroforestry, these are all concepts that are very mature now. There are case studies and examples for how these things are being implemented in different parts of the world. Amplifying and accelerating these ideas in the real world, that's what it's all about. So basically giving publicity to best practice and best policy. These are the key issues today, and I think without that we're not going to see the rapid change that we now need.
Herbie, thank you very much.
Pleasure.